Okay, hi everybody. Thanks for coming. So the plan for today is I'm estimating that I'll talk for maybe 35, hopefully no more than 40 minutes, and then we'll make space for a bit of discussion at the end, questions and other things like that. So the plan for today's Methods Café is as follows. I'd like to do a bit of an introduction to Gamestorming, consisting of some words on history, terminology, context, a little bit about sources, and then giving some quick examples just to give you an initial sense of what we might be dealing with here. Then a deep dive into patterns, essential techniques, and also the idea of game design, and we'll talk more about what that means in a few minutes. I want to briefly touch on some critical perspectives because it's always worth, when importing, shall we say, methods from the world of business or the private sector to at least make notes of some thoughts about what that may mean. Then I'd like to talk about how this has been useful to me in applications to ethnographic data analysis, and how I use this and how perhaps you might use this too. Then I have a couple of examples. I've actually gone ahead and mocked up some game spaces with some data, sample data, fake data, basically, to show you. And there'll be an opportunity for you to kind of go into those online whiteboards as well and take a look around and maybe try it a little bit. I do want to say that the space of time today is just simply too short for us to actually do a workshop together. And if there's any interest, then I'd be happy to come and attend such a thing or help somebody else plan one if you want to give it a shot. I want to talk very briefly about online tools. It's still the pandemic, and normally this would be done probably in a room with whiteboards and other things like that, and that may not necessarily be possible at the moment, but there are lots of online tools that can actually be made to work. And then finally, I have a sort of a select reading list. Wes has a PDF copy of the presentation that he can later on share with everybody. So that's, then you'll have the literature list and other references as well. Okay, so what is Gamestorming? Well, it's a popular label for various types of group workshop techniques using structured activities. The idea is to make these activities game-like, interactive, playful, non-serious, time-boxed, and finite. So kind of to create, a really low-stakes version of a business meeting of sorts. The objective in private sector and public sector organizations where I've encountered this is typically creativity, strategy, design, planning. So it's used to solve problems that aren't easily solved with simple meetings, acknowledging the idea that things that are trickier require a more open-ended approach than a simple discussion that takes you sort of from A to B. It's also become a bit of a sort of blanket term. I mean, there are lots of terms and lots of related ideas out there. Facilitated or collaborative workshops, co-design workshops, visual thinking workshops. These things are not necessarily the same as Gamestorming, but they're also more related than they are not. The term first appeared, this particular term, Gamestorming, first appeared around 2010 with the publication of this book, which I will be referring to copiously throughout the presentation. It's worth reading. It's mercifully short on business speak, and it's a pretty good thought starter. And what's really key about it is not just the sort of introduction to the method, of course, not in relation to ethnography or ethnographic data analysis, which is what I want to talk about a little bit here today, but more generally. But the book is also a really useful compendium of suggested games. So they have tons of example games with mockups, with game space layouts and other things like that. And as such, it's really worth reading because it gets you thinking about what are all the possible things you could do. The term gamestorming, I'm noticing more and more now that it's 10, 12 years into its existence. In the world of business anyway, has kind of started to stick and it's become a bit of a shorthand. So I frequently encounter friends and acquaintances now who tell me about how their organization does gamestorming, and I'm not entirely sure that they're referring to this particular method, but I think they're referring to this kind of general kind of blanket idea of these kinds of visual structured activities, structured meeting type activities. So next I'm going to give 3 quick examples, and these are actually drawn directly from the compendium of suggested games in the book. So I've actually screenshotted some of the, the game descriptions, as it were. Just to give you a flavor, I'm not suggesting that, these are the ones that I would suggest or anything like that, but just to give you a sense of the sort of breadth of what they have in the book. So here's one called Spectrum Mapping. And Spectrum Mapping is a game to reveal a group's range of views about a topic without forcing anyone to say them out loud or even to own them specifically. So the aim is to elicit a range of point of view preferences about a topic. During the initial pass, everyone posts up their perspective on the topic in no particular order. And then during a second pass, the group works together, usually with a facilitator, to arrange the ideas along a spectrum, so one gets a sense of all the different perspectives and points of view. I'm suddenly hearing a lot of noise. Is it possible that somebody is not muted? Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure where that's coming from.
Somebody's in traffic.
I see who it is. Okay, should be good now.
Thank you. The second example is called Campfire. And Campfire is a game that acknowledges the power of storytelling in organizations as a form of knowledge transmission, so as opposed to formal training, right? So the idea is effectively to acknowledge that the way people really get trained up in a new environment, in a new job, in a new organization, is by listening to others who might have had similar experiences in sort of ramping up and then sharing those informally. And the Campfire game, basically facilitates this idea, but puts it into a workshop. So, you might post up some thought starters around, topics, and then people would pick one, tell a story about their experience in relation to that topic in the organization. And then that card is taken and moves over to the story side of the board. And then, you go back to the wall of words and the next person picks another one. And this kind of fosters discussion and informal knowledge transfer, as it were. Here's the third and final example I want to offer at this moment. And this is sort of slightly more elaborate. This is called Design the Box. So this is a game to collaboratively create a box for an idea or a future product. And the box serves as a sort of symbolic focusing object. Usually the group is split into, a number of teams, each of which would be responsible for taking one idea or idea for a future product, perhaps if it's in a company context, and create essentially an empty box for it. You might actually give them materials and cardboard and pens and other things like that to make one. And the box then ends up being this kind of marketing or articulation of what the idea is. And then during the final round of the game, teams essentially sell their box, in other words, their product, back to the broader group. So it's kind of like a forward projection exercise. And so these are just some ideas. Again, I'm not suggesting that these in particular would be appropriate or useful in the context of ethnographic data analysis, but it just gives you a sense of the sort of breadth of these types of activities. We'll talk in a bit about what makes them game-like and how they work, or how the idea works in more detail. So I'll quickly go through some patterns. These are useful to understand because, as you can probably guess by now, in part, this method is very much about designing your own game. You need to decide what it is you want to do and how you want to accomplish that with a group. You might pick elements from the compendium, but ultimately it probably makes the most sense to not pull something off the rack and somehow make it fit, but simply use these simple ingredients or components to make your own. And so the first thing to think about is that Gamestorming really, as an approach, facilitates working towards fuzzy goals rather than clear goals, right? So it's not really something that facilitates getting from A to B in this kind of linear way, which could easily be described as a process or a simple decision-making pattern. But it's really usually deployed in situations where the outcome is unknown. The outcome could fall along a range of possible outcomes. So that's maybe the first thing to think about. The fuzzy goal tends to play a role. A game is designed to get us from A to B, exploring divergent paths, ideas, or possibilities along the way. So this shape you'll see, I guess, a lot in the diagrams that follow. A game has inputs and outputs. In Gamestorming, the inputs are most often people and resources, the stuff that you need to play the game. And then outputs of some kind, output some kind of insight, strategy, or group alignment or consensus. A game typically has 3 acts: opening, exploring, and closing. A game's opening phase is divergent to collect or document ideas, observations, items to be explored. So this is kind of the data, not so much the data gathering, but maybe the data sorting or looking over phase. The exploring phase is emergent. Items are discussed, moved around, grouped, debated, reframed, etc. And then a game's closing phase is convergent. During it, the group aims to reach cohesion, agreement, or consensus about the items being discussed. And fitting it all together, the overall shape looks something like this. The book also suggests that you can play games in advanced patterns. And so we'll very, very briefly take a look. So it's possible to string games together into a bigger event, to play multiple games concurrently, to accommodate large groups of participants, and even construct day-long collaborative Gamestorming events. Again, the overall shape is not that dissimilar to the basic game, but here, as you can see, obviously lunch is very important in these kinds of meetings, but you have something in the middle that, where people come together in different contexts, and then they might break out into different groups. So the idea is you could string, if you do a whole day event or even a multi-day event, you plan out a series of games and their connections to each other. You can potentially make your way through quite a lot of, you can cover quite a lot of ground. Now, in terms of materials, how is this usually done? The first thing that you really do need is a whiteboard, ideally multiple whiteboards. Again, I'll talk a little bit later about digital tooling for this, which is widely available and actually fairly straightforward to use these days. But classically, and once I suppose we have the opportunity again, you would probably do this with a group of people in a room that where they can move around. Often these rooms are set up with multiple whiteboards. You need sticky notes, lots and lots of sticky notes. You need Sharpies for people to write their thoughts and ideas and observations onto those sticky notes. You need dry erase markers in order to do grouping and other types of activities on the whiteboard itself. What's very useful is dot stickers. These can easily be bought in dollar stores or Staples or whatever. This is something that is kind of important to remember because it's not the sort of thing that you would necessarily always have to hand, but quite useful, and I'll explain a little bit later how they are used. And then finally, I find having a smartphone essentially as some sort of camera there in order to document the outcomes because you want to obviously have something that sort of lasts, that comes out of it. And the easiest way to do that is obviously by just simply taking a picture. There are now apps that do a really good job of capturing things that are written by hand on whiteboards and actually translating what's been written into text and so on. So there's lots of that sort of stuff out there. So these are the common materials you would use, and then much later in the presentation, we'll briefly look at some online tools, one of which I'll show you as well. Okay, and then let's move on to essential game storming techniques. These headings here are grabbed straight from the book. I've highlighted 3 of them that I do want to talk about in a little bit more detail. The cafe is relatively short today, so we just don't have enough time to go into detail on all of these. Again, I'd encourage you to take a look at the book. It's really worth paging through at least. So they talk about opening and closing, fire starting, artifacts, and we've kind of talked about artifacts in terms of the materials already. There are, of course, other artifacts that they refer to. If you think back to the example of the, design a box game, you would need other kinds of things, and actually the group would be constructing artifacts of sorts as part of the game. They talk about meaningful space, which is sort of the idea of board design, if you imagine creating a board game, and node generation, something they refer to as the post-up. And those 2 things I really do want to talk about in some more detail in a minute. Other essential techniques include things like sketching and model making, randomness, reversal, and reframing. And you'll see in some of these words, you'll see things that to anthropologists at least make a lot of sense. A lot of this is about asking good questions, about reframing, about trying something different, about recontextualizing things, and so on and so forth. So I think that as a group of people with a sort of broadly shared kind of background in and training in elicitation techniques, I suppose, you would actually find lots that would come quite easily to you in this. Okay, so the 3 that I've highlighted we'll now talk about in just a little bit more detail, because I think it's worthwhile thinking about those. So opening and closing, this is really the framing for the workshop or game. A lot of opening is really about preparation. It's obviously a terrible idea to sort of go into a room with all the stuff and have no plan. So I'd advise you strongly against that. But the idea is, of course, to start about thinking about the relationship between the purpose of the game, the materials available, the planned game design, and then getting the appropriate materials ready and distributing them to participants. Think about the pattern of the game, timing, board design, prepare a board if necessary. We'll talk more about this in a minute. And then preparing something that they call fire starting, which is essentially a question or provocation that sparks the group's interest and imagination. Nothing worse than sitting or standing in a room in front of a bunch of people and saying, so what do you guys want to talk about? Closing is about pulling threads together or closing still open ones, and also provides to participants a sense that their contributions were valuable, what will happen next. So a form of closure, really. Moving on to what they call meaningful space. So this idea of board design. So the whiteboard or boards should be designed or divided up into a game storming space suited to the task. So this is a mix of boundary setting, rule articulation, and process indication, process guidance, I suppose. Game storming accomplishes a lot by moving ideas around or moving data on sticky notes around into and out of proximity to each other, or by grouping them, marking them up with labels, articulating possible interpretations or even expressions of interest or support by using techniques like voting and other things like that. And the space design should support the 3-act idea: opening, exploring, and closing. So, it should be possible to move from one area to the next, and for distinct things to happen in those different areas of the board, the whiteboard, the gaming space. Then there's node generation. They call this the post-up. This is really worth thinking about. particularly as it pertains to what we'll talk about in a minute, applying this idea to ethnographic data analysis. Because I think, ethnographic data in whatever form it comes in is so rich, and there's often so much of it in early stage exploration that without a fair bit of preparation and actually getting a bunch of sticky notes with data points ready and having them in the room already, often the workshop just takes too long. So what they suggest is that, in a business context, the entire group initially sits quietly and writes their initial responses to the fire starter question. And the benefit of the silent group post-up is that, there's a diversity of ideas because there's no, let's say, social contamination from seeing everyone else's right away. There's a high initial yield of data, and also introverts get the same attention as everyone else, which is, important because often in meetings, extroverts kind of implicitly win by just sort of, taking over. There's also an alternative approach, which is probably where I would go for using these techniques in ethnographic data analysis, which is that if it's the facilitator's data or some other existing corpus of data that's going to be used for analysis, I think the work needs to be done prior to the workshop to actually write things down, write data points down, gather photos that will be stuck up on the whiteboard and other types of things. So there's an aspect of kind of prep work and also curation that goes on. It is worth, for both board design and node generation, it's worth just acknowledging that these things, that whatever gets selected and however the thing is structured, however you choose to structure the thing, has epistemological implications, right? So this isn't it works for certain reasons. It doesn't work for certain other reasons. However, what you choose to offer and how you choose to structure what you offer will obviously influence the outcome. So I think, there are no defensive techniques against this. This is true for any kind of data analysis, any type of group dynamic, any type of workshop kind of situation. But it's worth just acknowledging that this is so, and perhaps, using reflexivity and other tools in an anthropologist's arsenal to keep it in mind and to try and understand why you're making certain choices and what you expect to happen and whether that actually happened or not. Briefly, I'd like to talk about some critical perspectives. Critiques from so-called critical design practitioners and scholars are that gamestorming and other collaborative workshop techniques are often performed by organizations to manufacture consent, or to symbolically be able to point to something later and say, "See, we consulted you." So this didn't used to be understood like this, but certainly in the last 5 years or so, it's become more prevalent as a critique. It's true, I see this every day in my consulting world to some extent. However, it's not always the case. But it's often, if it's deployed as a method in sort of public citizen interfaces where it does tend to happen like that, it's worth thinking about, it's worth knowing about, and keeping in the back of your mind. In knowledge work organizations, the employee, of course, operates under the misassumption that they freely allocate their time and attention to work tasks. It's essentially part of the definition of what makes a knowledge worker. And it's somewhat ironic that to get them into a room or workshop at the same time, something fun and engaging, in other words, a game, is required. There's lots of critical purchase there. Again, no time today to really think about this more deeply. But it's sort of an interesting and worthwhile idea to just contemplate. It's also worth remembering that sticky notes and whiteboards are not familiar or comfortable to every person or community, and neither are online whiteboards. I have, I've heard many stories from people who've tried to run these kinds of things in certain communities where it just did not work. People aren't familiar with sticky notes and whiteboards, and it created such an artificial type of space that they had to kind of rethink the whole idea behind the workshop. And then finally, there are these neologisms that are kind of evolving: edutainment, cognitainment, and their emergence may suggest, general trends. There is a kind of dynamic, broadly speaking, between this notion that work should be difficult, right? This kind of passion narrative of work and accomplishment and education and so on and so forth, which is really a journey of overcoming. And then that entertainment should somehow be the opposite of work. And somehow the idea of Gamestorming fits into that unstable dynamic. Again, no time to really reflect on this terribly deeply, but I feel like it's a worthwhile idea to think about it, and might offer some, for anyone who actually wants to use this as part of their methodology, you might want to think about this more deeply. What is this interplay? Why is this either attractive or required, or how does the idea of an entertaining knowledge or cognition activity, what role does that play? Okay, so on to Gamestorming and ethnographic data analysis. I've been using various Gamestorming techniques in group research analysis for years. I find that it's probably best used for preliminary analysis, orientation, wayfinding, direction setting, surveying a space. In my view, it works well for these reasons. It gathers lots of different perspectives on the same corpus. It rapidly helps bring to light threads and themes a single researcher would not see, including things you might not want to see. It provides a sense of what is of interest to the group and what isn't. If the group involves non-researchers, for example, clients or interlocutors, Gamestorming can be an easy, fairly equitable way of demystifying the process by showing the work. It can help address suspicions, possibly issues of power, and it also helps to socialize research outcomes from an early stage. Of course, it does not replace coding, thinking, writing, editing, etc. In terms of possible applications, I mean, here are just some ideas that I have, that where I could imagine that it would work in an academic world. For example, if you're back from the field overwhelmed with data, looking to reconnect with peers, right? You could play the help me sort and make sense of my data game. If you're conducting a community engaged research project, but it's unclear how to involve the community after fieldwork, this happens all the time in that kind of research work. The let's look at everything together and sort through it game. If you teach undergrad fieldwork and everyone does a version of the same project, you could play the integrate our data and make sense of it game, possibly followed by the imagine new ways of presenting our findings game. So, you could see how this could be applied in a number of different contexts. I have used it fairly frequently with clients, client teams. And again, the benefits for me are that it exposes people to not just the research data, but also the process of analysis. It helps me understand what are their interests, preferences, what do they see that I don't see, and so on and so forth. So I've never not found some version of this useful. Okay, so next I want to do a show and tell, and I believe I have sent some URLs and login details to Wes, who's going to paste them into the chat. What we'll do is this. I've mocked up a couple of Miro whiteboards. Miro is one of these whiteboard applications, shared whiteboard applications. And I'm going to go in and share a different screen and show you the Miro boards that I have created for this event. Okay. I believe you should now be seeing something that looks a bit like a whiteboard with a bunch of pictures on it, titled Collective Seeing and Theme Development, Street Vendors in Vietnam. So what I've done here is I've made 2 of these boards, and this is fake data. This is not based on real data, but it's meant to kind of illustrate how this can be used. So the first one that I created here is sort of like collective seeing. So this pretends that, you know, we're back from the field and we have brought back images of street vendors in Vietnam. And the idea is to ask a group of people to come in and add their observations to the photos using sticky notes. And then in a second pass of our game, add questions about their observations, about what they're seeing in the photos, things they can't explain, things that make sense to them, don't make sense to them, things that might constitute connections and things like that. Then there would be another phase, a third phase, which I would think of as theme development, where we kind of look at the observations and the questions, and we use a different color of sticky note again, and we write down what might be some themes that emerge from our observations and questions and from these photos that we might want to invest in for further analysis, further discussion, and so on. And then there would be a final phase in the game. This would kind of be more towards the closing piece of the game shape that I showed you earlier, where we would use something called dot voting. And so dot voting, remember I talked about this, the stickers, is this idea that every participant gets a limited number of those sticky dots. And then in order to essentially vote for themes, because we might not be able to use all the themes, or to get an understanding of which themes are actually most important in relation to this corpus, we would ask participants to, you know, put dots onto various themes that they feel strongly about. And then perhaps in closing arguments, as it were, we might ask them to talk about what is important about that for them, and so on and so forth. So this gives you a sense of kind of a basic shape of a game. This one might take a couple of hours to play, maybe at the outside, depending on the amount of discussion. So you can sort of see what I've done here. I've created the structured space for it, where I have sort of like the data and initial data analysis area. I've made lots of stickies available for people to pick the right color and kind of, you know, to ask questions, to post observations, and so on. The lines implicitly suggest that one could, on a whiteboard, one could actually draw connections from one sticky to multiple images in this case. In Miro, it's much easier because there are digital lines and digital connections. So that's kind of an idea of what such a whiteboard could look like. And it's also possible to document the game using your camera at different stages. This is maybe worthwhile doing as well. Often these events work particularly well if you have photos from at different points, going back through time to sort of see what happened, because a lot of meaning can potentially come out of proximity. So in other words, where do stickies cluster? Where do dots cluster? Where is a sticky first placed, and then later on, why is it being moved somewhere else? What's the connection there, and other things like that. So it's worth, as you sort of play around with the format, it's worth just kind of keeping an eye, as it were, on documenting things to see kind of how they progress, how they develop, and so on and so forth. Okay. So I know I'm going at a super rapid pace here, but I do want to try and leave some time for discussion as well. I'll show you the second one now, and so we'll switch contexts. This one here I call cut up notes and interviews. So this is a fake version of a real game I've played any number of times. Unfortunately, I can't really bring you real client data to play around with. So what I have done here is, so the way I would ordinarily use this type of game is, if I already have an existing corpus of field notes and particularly interview transcripts, I would do a bunch of prep work, and I would essentially cut up the text and do an initial post up. So I would say this area over here that I'm sort of highlighting stickies on right now would be where I would put the initial data. So what I've done here, somewhat somewhat silly, but I've essentially taken the first 2 paragraphs of Kafka's short story, The Metamorphosis, and I've cut it up, and that's the data that we are using here. So the idea is to take some aspect of field data, post it up, and you could do something slightly more you could do something slightly more sophisticated and use photos and text or other types of things. And then when the group joins the game, when the group comes into the game, I might explain, so what we have here, what is this data, and so on and so forth, what's it about? And then I would ask them to come up and read the data that's there, and think perhaps initially quietly about what relates to what, where do they see connections, what's of interest to them, and so on. And then I would ask them, so I've created in the sorting it into themes area here, I've created some kind of structured space. Advice from the Gamestorming book, which I think is good advice, is to say, okay, well, make columns available for people to put like with like, but encourage them not to label things initially, because, and you all know this from other data analysis work that you've done, that jumping to a label too soon, in a sense, locks things in too soon and may often lead down, not exactly the right path. So this idea of kind of sorting different aspects of text or text and images into areas that belong together, that relate somehow. And it can be done, of course, by sticking them closer together and also further apart, by sort of clustering them. But it's worth experimenting with sort of ideas of dividing the board and providing some kind of structured space for people to work in. Then in the next pass of this game, we might get to naming themes and connecting and resorting. So here I would then kind of take one of these groups that the participants are settling on, move it over into the next area and say, okay, well, what are we going to call this? And what are our observations about it? What are our questions about it? How can we think about this? And in this space, I think there's a lot of sorting and resorting and moving things around and so on that happens. A lot of the typical sort of aspects of meaning making. And then again, we might use dot voting for the themes in order to kind of get an understanding of what people think is actually important here versus what not. One last thing that I would like to show you that I've done that's been actually fairly useful to me on a number of occasions is not only to document visually using my camera, but also once the game is over, collect the themes with the attached data, as it were, right? The original white stickies with the data, and put them into individual envelopes, which I label with the theme, the theme's kind of title. What that does in some odd way is it creates a sort of, a sort of referential catalog of what was done, and kind of, I can always open the envelope back up and take the stuff back out and kind of say, oh, I see, okay, well, here's something I forgot, but that's interesting that we did think that this was part of this theme, and so on. So I found that fairly useful. Okay, so that's the super high-speed walkthrough of these 2 whiteboards. Now just a couple more slides, and then I will be ready for questions. So let me see here. I think this is the right screen to share. Can you see something that says show and tell?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. So then these were the Miro board URLs and passwords. You don't need them right now. Online tools, other online tools. Miro is my recommendation. You can use it for free. And you've just seen how you can use it with many different participants. It's quite easy to do. I think it limits you in terms of the number of boards you can do. One thing you can keep in mind about Miro is that the size of the whiteboard is literally limitless in all directions, which basically means, even if you only get a limited number of actual whiteboards, you can just use the same whiteboard and kind of scroll to another space that's white and kind of keep working there on even a different project. Mural is another one of these products, also pretty good. I personally don't have a ton of experience with it, but I've seen it a few times. Google has something called Jamboard, which to me seems a little bit more oriented towards drawing with a pen. So that's kind of like for people who have, I don't know, an iPad with an Apple Pencil or something like that. It works quite well. I'm not personally familiar with the Microsoft whiteboard, but since I think many people at universities have Microsoft 365, I think it's part of that. So you may have access to that for free. There are many of these, and you can absolutely sort of find free stuff to use out there that's perfectly reasonable for this type of activity. I've included just a sort of select reading list here. It's very short, but you can sort of poke around some of these. These are some of the better things that I have found in this space, but also specifically cut down to sort of my recommendations of what might be useful to somebody thinking about using Gamestorming techniques for sort of collaborative data analysis. The reading list will be available in the PDF, which I think Wes can post around now, and then ultimately just how to get in touch with me, and that's also in there, and you're very welcome to connect any way you like. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm happy to take questions.